Picture this. You are standing in a dense jungle. The air is thick and wet. Somewhere in the undergrowth, something moves. You cannot see it, but you can hear it. A low, rapid clicking sound, almost like a bird. Almost. Then it steps into the light, and it is nothing like what you expected. It stands roughly knee-height. It is covered in feathers. Its snout is narrow, almost bird-like, and it weighs about the same as a medium-sized dog, somewhere around 15 to 20 kilograms. Hardly the stuff of nightmares. Now forget everything Jurassic Park ever showed you, because the creature you just imagined, small, feathered, fast, and deeply strange, that is the real Velociraptor mongoliensis, a predator that actually walked this earth approximately 75 to 71 million years ago. And the gap between what science knows and what Hollywood sold you is so enormous, so deliberately wide, that it raises a question that goes far beyond one dinosaur species. Why did they lie? And more importantly, what did they hide? Because when you pull back the curtain on Velociraptor, you do not just find a different animal. You find an entirely different world. A world where the predators of the Cretaceous period were stranger, more complex, and in many ways more terrifying than anything a special effects team could render on screen. This is not a story about a movie getting some details wrong. This is a story about how one of the most famous animals in cinematic history became a mask. A mask worn over the face of something science is still struggling to fully understand. A creature whose real biology, real behavior, and real ecological role challenge some of our deepest assumptions about what a dinosaur even was. Over the next hour, we are going to strip that mask away, layer by layer, bone by bone. We will travel to the Gobi Desert, where the first Velociraptor skull was pulled from red sandstone in 1923. We will examine the fighting dinosaurs specimen, one of the most extraordinary fossil discoveries in the history of paleontology. We will look at what isotope analysis, CT scanning, and biomechanical modeling have revealed about how this animal actually lived, moved, hunted, and died. And then we will go further. Because Velociraptor was not alone. It was part of a family. The Dromaeosaurids that spread across almost every continent and produced some of the most sophisticated predators the Mesozoic world ever saw. Some of them were bigger than Velociraptor. Some were smaller. Some had anatomical features so bizarre that they still do not fit neatly into any behavioral model we have. We will meet Deinonychus and Utahraptor, the animal that actually inspired the raptors in Jurassic Park, and whose discovery in the 1960s quietly rewrote everything paleontologists thought they knew about dinosaur intelligence and posture. We will look at Utahraptor ostromysorum, a genuine giant whose existence was confirmed in the same year Jurassic Park hit theaters. A coincidence so perfect, it almost feels scripted. And we will examine Microraptor gui, a four-winged predator so strange that when its fossils first appeared in China in 2003, some researchers genuinely could not agree on which way it flew. But before any of that, before the fossils, the fieldwork, the scientific revolutions, we need to understand the world these animals actually lived in. Because the Cretaceous period was not a backdrop, it was not scenery. It was a pressure system, a complex, dynamic, and often violent planetary environment that shaped every bone, every claw, every feather of every animal that lived through it. And once you understand that world, once you really feel the weight of 75 million years of deep time pressing down on you, the Hollywood version does not just look inaccurate, it looks almost laughably small. Stay with me, because we are just getting started. Let us go back, far back, not 75 million years, not 100 million. Let us go back to the very beginning of the Cretaceous period, approximately 145 million years ago, and watch the world take shape around us. The planet you are standing on looks nothing like home. The continents are still drifting. Laurasia, the northern supercontinent, is slowly tearing itself apart. The Atlantic Ocean exists, but it is narrow, almost adolescent, barely wider than the modern Mediterranean. South America and Africa have already separated, but the gap between them is still closing. Antarctica is green. The Arctic is warm. There are no ice caps anywhere on Earth. The average global temperature is somewhere between 6 and 10 degrees Celsius higher than today. The oceans are shallow and warm, and they cover enormous portions of what we now call dry land. A vast inland sea, the Western Interior Seaway, splits North America down the middle, running from the Arctic Ocean all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. If you stood on the shore of that sea and looked west, you would be looking toward a chain of mountains rising along what will one day become the Rocky Mountain Range. And in the forests and floodplains along those shores, something extraordinary is happening. Life is exploding. Not metaphorically, not slowly, explosively, diversely, in every direction at once. The early Cretaceous sees the first flowering plants, the angiosperms, beginning to spread across the landscape. Before this, the world was dominated by ferns, cycads, and conifers, green but monotonous. Then suddenly, geologically speaking, flowers appear. And with flowers come insects in new varieties and new numbers. And with insects come new pressures on every animal that depends on them. The food web rewires itself. Ecosystems become more complex, more layered, more competitive. And into this complexity step the dinosaurs. They have already been here for 80 million years by the time the Cretaceous begins. They are not newcomers. They are established. They are dominant. But the Cretaceous does not let anything stay comfortable for long. This is the key thing Hollywood never tells you about the world Velociraptor lived in. It was not a stable world. It was not a predictable world. The late Cretaceous, the specific slice of time between approximately 83 and 66 million years ago, the period that scientists call the Maastrichtian and the Campanian ages, was a world of constant environmental flux. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically over relatively short periods. Volcanic activity in what is now India, the Deccan Traps, was releasing enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years before the asteroid ever arrived. Ecosystems were already under stress. Species were already shifting, adapting, dying out, and being replaced. Velociraptor mongoliensis lived in the Campanian age, roughly 75 to 71 million years ago. And it lived specifically in what is now the Gobi Desert of Mongolia and China. But here is the thing that should stop you for a moment. The Gobi Desert today is one of the harshest environments on Earth. Extreme temperatures, almost no rainfall, vast, punishing stretches of rock and sand. 75 million years ago, it was not a desert at all. The region that paleontologists call the Jadokta Formation, the geological layer where most Velociraptor fossils have been found, was a semi-arid environment. Sandy dunes, yes, but also seasonal rivers, floodplains, scrubby vegetation, a landscape that was dry but not lifeless, more like a savanna than a wasteland. Temperatures were warm but not extreme. And this environment supported an entire community of animals that most people have never heard of. and that collectively paint a picture of an ecosystem so specific, so detailed, and so strange that it feels almost alien. In the Judokta Formation, Velociraptor shared its world with Protoceratops andrewsi, a sheep-sized ceratopsian with a distinctive frill and a notoriously powerful bite. We will return to the relationship between these two animals in considerable detail, because it is one of the most important stories in all of dinosaur paleontology. It involves a fossil so extraordinary that when it was discovered, scientists genuinely debated whether it was real. Velociraptor also shared its world with Oviraptor Philoceratops, a crested, beaked dinosaur whose name means egg thief, a name that turns out to be completely wrong and deeply unfair, as we will see. With Gobi Desert, a tiny, long-legged dinosaur with a skull so lightly built it almost looks like a cartoon. With early mammals scurrying through the underbrush, waiting for their moment, a moment that was still 70 million years away. With lizards, crocodilians, pterosaurs soaring overhead on wingspans that could exceed 3 meters. This was not a world with one dominant predator. This was a web, a dense, complicated, interdependent web of species, all competing for the same limited resources in a landscape that could go months without rain and then flood catastrophically in a single afternoon. And into this web, Velociraptor fit as a medium-sized predator. Not at the top, not at the bottom. Somewhere in the dangerous competitive middle, where survival required not just speed and strength, but something that paleontologists are only now beginning to properly appreciate: flexibility, intelligence, social awareness. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can talk about what Velociraptor did, we need to talk about what it actually was. And that story begins not in the Gobi Desert itself, but in a museum basement in New York City in the winter of 1923, when a young paleontologist named Peter Kaizen opened a crate that had just arrived from Mongolia and found a skull unlike anything he had ever seen. The year is 1923. The American Museum of Natural History in New York is in the middle of one of the most ambitious scientific expeditions in paleontological history. A man named Roy Chapman Andrews, adventurer, naturalist, and by many accounts the closest thing to a real-life Indiana Jones that the 20th century ever produced, has convinced the museum to fund a series of expeditions into the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. The stated goal is to find evidence of early human ancestors. The assumption, based on theories popular at the time, is that Central Asia might be the cradle of human evolution. They find no human ancestors. What they find instead changes paleontology forever. Andrews and his team, traveling by camel caravan and early motor vehicles across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, discovered dinosaur eggs. The first dinosaur eggs ever found by Western science. They discover Protoceratops in enormous numbers. They discover Oviraptor. They discover early mammals. And on one expedition, in a layer of reddish sandstone in a location the team calls the Flaming Cliffs, Bayanzag in Mongolian, Peter Kaizen, the expedition's chief fossil preparator, uncovers a partial skull and a few associated bones. The skull is small, elongated. The jaws are lined with small, serrated teeth. The eye socket is large relative to the brain case, and there is something about the overall proportions, something lean and quick and alert, that immediately sets it apart from anything the team has seen before. Andrews and the expedition's lead paleontologist, Henry Fairfield Osborn, examine the specimen carefully. Osborn names it in 1924. He chooses the name Velociraptor mongoliensis. Velociraptor. From the Latin velox, meaning swift, and raptor, meaning seizer or thief. Swift Caesar. It is a good name, a dramatic name, and as names go, it turns out to be remarkably accurate, though not quite in the way Osborne imagined, because in 1924, nobody had any idea what Velociraptor really looked like. The skull was there, partial and fragmentary, a few limb bones, enough to establish that this was a bipedal predator, probably fast, probably agile. But the full picture, the feathers, the proportions, the sickle claw, the behavioral complexity, all of that was still decades away from being understood. For 30 years after its discovery, Velociraptor sat in relative obscurity. It was known to specialists, it appeared in technical literature, but it was not famous. It was not iconic. It was simply one predatory dinosaur among many, interesting, but not extraordinary. And then, in 1971, a Polish-Mongolian expedition working in the Gobi Desert made a discovery so remarkable that even today, more than 50 years later, it still stops paleontologists cold when they see it. They found two dinosaurs locked together in combat, not metaphorically, not in separate locations that suggested a fight had occurred nearby, literally together, intertwined, fossilized in the exact moment of a struggle that had been interrupted by a sandstorm, most researchers believe, approximately 74 million years ago. The specimen is now known simply as the fighting dinosaurs. It sits today in the Mongolian Museum of Natural History in Ulaanbaatar, and it is one of the most extraordinary objects in the entire history of paleontology. Here is what the fossil shows. A Velociraptor mongoliensis, roughly 1.5 meters long from snout to tail, has its right foreleg embedded in the throat region of a Protoceratops andrewsi. The sickle-shaped claw on the Velociraptor's right hind foot, the famous enlarged second toe claw, approximately 6.5 centimeters long, is positioned against the neck and lower jaw of the Protoceratops. The Protoceratops, in turn, has the right forearm of the Velociraptor clamped in its beak. The bone shows compression fractures consistent with a bite that was still active at the moment of death. Both animals died simultaneously, killing each other, or trying to. When researchers at the Mongolian Academy of Sciences first fully described this specimen in the 1993 paper published in the journal Science, the paleontological community spent weeks debating what exactly the fossil showed. Was Velociraptor attacking? Was it scavenging and then trapped? Was Protoceratops defending itself from an ambush? Or had it initiated the confrontation? The current consensus, supported by biomechanical analysis of the claw positioning and the orientation of the limbs, is that Velociraptor was the aggressor. It had attacked the Protoceratops, an animal that outweighed it considerably, possibly by a factor of 2 to 1, and the fight had gone wrong. The Protoceratops had seized the raptor's arm. The raptor had driven its sickle claw into the ceratopsian's throat, and at that exact moment, a wall of sand had buried them both. 74 million years, perfectly preserved. But this specimen does more than tell a single story of predation. It raises an immediate and uncomfortable question about Velociraptor's hunting strategy. Because a Protoceratops was not small prey, an adult Protoceratops andrewsi could weigh anywhere from 80 to 180 kilograms, depending on the individual. Velociraptor, by contrast, weighed somewhere between 15 and 20 kilograms. That is a predator attacking prey that potentially outweighed it by a factor of 9 to 1. Either Velociraptor was extraordinarily bold, almost recklessly so, or it was not hunting alone. And this is where the science gets genuinely interesting. Because the question of whether Dromaeosaurids hunted in packs, a question that Jurassic Park answered with absolute cinematic confidence, turns out to be one of the most contested and unresolved debates in all of dinosaur paleontology. We will come back to it in detail, with the evidence laid out on both sides. But first, we need to talk about the sickle claw, because Hollywood got this wrong too. And the way it got it wrong tells you everything about the difference between dramatic storytelling and scientific thinking. In Jurassic Park, the raptors use their enlarged second toe claw to slash, to rip, to tear open prey with a single powerful stroke. It is a devastating slashing weapon, held slightly raised off the ground as the animal runs, then deployed like a switchblade in the moment of attack. The slashing part, that is the Hollywood invention. In 2005, a research team led by Manning, Payne, Hodgson, Barrett, and Rayfield published a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B that used computer modeling to analyze the biomechanics of the Dromaeosaurid sickle claw. They tested two hypotheses. First, that the claw was used to slash through flesh in a raking motion. Second, that it was used as a gripping or pinning tool to hold prey rather than cut it. The results were unambiguous. The claw was not strong enough to slash effectively through large prey. The curvature and the structural strength of the bone were not consistent with a slashing weapon. What the geometry and biomechanics strongly suggested instead was a piercing and gripping tool, something used to anchor the raptor to the side of a larger animal, to dig in and hold on. The current leading hypothesis, sometimes called the raptor prey restraint model, developed primarily by Denver Fowler and colleagues in a 2011 paper published in PLOS One, proposes something almost more disturbing than the Hollywood version. Velociraptor, according to this model, attacked prey by leaping onto it, gripping with its forelimbs, which were strong and flexible, more like wings in structure than arms, a point we will return to, driving the sickle claw into the prey's flesh not to slash, but to anchor, and then holding on. While the prey struggled and thrashed and tried to shake the raptor off, the raptor used its grip to stay mounted, balancing, riding the animal, and using its jaws, not its claws, to deliver the killing bite. The comparison that Fowler's team used in their paper was striking. They noted that this behavior closely mirrors what modern birds of prey, particularly hawks and eagles, do when they catch large prey. They grip, they hold, they use their weight and their claws as anchors while they apply the killing force with their beaks, which is, when you think about it, exactly what you would expect from an animal that was, in a very real biological sense, a bird. Because that is the other thing Hollywood never properly explained to you. Velociraptor was not like a bird. Velociraptor was not bird adjacent. Velociraptor was not a dinosaur that happened to share some features with birds. Velociraptor was, by every meaningful phylogenetic definition, a bird. Or more precisely, birds are living dromaeosaurids. The evolutionary distance between Velociraptor mongoliensis and a modern hawk is smaller than the evolutionary distance between a modern crocodile and a modern lizard. Let that sit for a moment. The animal that terrorized a kitchen in 1993, that hunted children through a laboratory, that became the symbol of Mesozoic predatory intelligence. Its closest living relatives are currently sitting in trees, eating seeds, and occasionally stealing chips from tourists. And the implications of that relationship, for how Velociraptor looked, how it moved, how it thought, how it communicated, are profound enough that they rewrote the entire field of dinosaur paleontology over the course of about 20 years. That rewriting begins with a man named John Ostrom, and it begins not in Mongolia, but in Montana. in the summer of 1964, on a riverbank in the Cloverly Formation, where a graduate student named James A. Jensen was working a dig site and called his supervisor over to look at something unusual. Something with a very large, very curved, very familiar-looking claw. John Ostrom was 36 years old in 1964. He was a paleontologist at Yale University's Peabody Museum of Natural History, and he had been working the Cloverly Formation in Montana and Wyoming for several seasons. The Cloverly Formation is a geological layer deposited during the early Cretaceous period, approximately 115 to 108 million years ago, and it had already yielded interesting material. But nothing like this. What Jensen had found, and what Ostrom would spend the next several field seasons carefully excavating, was a predatory dinosaur unlike anything that had been formally described before. It was larger than Velociraptor. Its estimated length was roughly 3.5 meters from snout to tail tip. Its estimated weight, based on limb bone proportions, was somewhere between 70 and 100 kilograms. And on its hind foot, raised off the ground in exactly the posture that would become famous 30 years later in a Steven Spielberg film, was a sickle-shaped claw approximately 12 centimeters long. Ostrom named it in 1969, Deinonychus anteropus, terrible claw. The name practically writes itself. But the name was almost secondary, because what Ostrom did with this animal, the way he looked at its bones and read their implications, was nothing short of a scientific revolution. And the reverberations of that revolution are still being felt today. Here is the problem Ostrom was confronting. In 1964, the scientific consensus on dinosaurs was essentially fixed. It had been fixed for decades. Dinosaurs were slow. Dinosaurs were cold-blooded. Dinosaurs were, in the grand sweep of evolutionary history, failures. Overgrown reptiles that stumbled through 160 million years of dominance before being wiped out by an asteroid, leaving nothing behind but bones and a lesson about the dangers of getting too large. This was not a fringe view. This was the mainstream. It was in textbooks. It was in museum displays. The great dinosaur halls of the American Museum of Natural History in New York showed their specimens in sluggish, tail-dragging postures, massive, lumbering, barely animated. The image of the dinosaur as a glorified lizard was so embedded in scientific culture that challenging it required not just new evidence, but a fundamental shift in how paleontologists were willing to think. Ostrom looked at Deinonychus and saw something that simply could not be reconciled with the slow, cold-blooded model. The tail was stiff, reinforced with elongated bony projections called zygapophyses that ran along the vertebrae and locked much of the tail into a rigid horizontal rod. This was not the tail of an animal that dragged it along the ground. This was a dynamic balancing organ, a counterweight. The kind of structure you see in animals that are built for rapid, agile movement. Animals that need to shift their center of gravity quickly and precisely. The hind limbs were long and slender, with proportions that suggested fast running. The forelimbs were large and mobile, capable of a wide range of motion that was more consistent with grasping than with simple locomotion. The brain case, relative to body size, was large. The eye sockets were large. The overall skeletal architecture spoke not of a slow, stupid reptile, but of something fast, alert, and cognitively active. And then there was the sickle claw, 12 centimeters of curved, compressed bone. Held off the ground in life, Ostrom could see this from the joint anatomy, from the way the toe bones articulated. Not a walking surface, a weapon. A specialized, dedicated weapon on an animal whose entire body seemed designed around rapid, coordinated movement. Ostrom published his full description of Deinonychus in 1969, and then, over the following years, he began to draw out the implications. In a series of papers published through the early and mid-1970s, Ostrom argued something that the paleontological establishment found deeply uncomfortable. He argued that dinosaurs, or at least some dinosaurs, were warm-blooded, that they had high metabolic rates, that they were active, dynamic animals whose physiology was fundamentally different from modern reptiles and much closer to modern birds. And then he went further. In 1973, Ostrom began comparing the skeleton of Deinonychus systematically with the skeleton of Archaeopteryx, the famous feathered fossil from the Jurassic period of Bavaria, long considered the first bird. What he found was a degree of anatomical similarity that went far beyond coincidence. The wishbone, the wrist structure, the proportions of the forelimbs, the structure of the shoulder girdle. In a landmark 1976 paper, Ostrom formally revived a hypothesis that had been proposed by Thomas Henry Huxley back in 1868 and then largely abandoned. He argued that birds did not evolve from some generalized archosaur ancestor. Birds evolved directly from theropod dinosaurs, specifically from animals very much like Deinonychus. Birds were not related to dinosaurs. Birds were dinosaurs. The reaction from the paleontological community was mixed, to put it generously. Some researchers embraced the hypothesis immediately. Others resisted it for years, decades in some cases. The debate played out in journals and at conferences and in the pages of popular science publications throughout the 1970s and 80s. And then the fossils from China arrived. In the mid-1990s, a series of extraordinary discoveries from the Yishan and Jiufotang formations in Liaoning Province, northeastern China, began to provide the physical evidence that Ostrom's hypothesis had been built on anatomical inference alone. These formations, deposited approximately 130 to 120 million years ago, were preserving something that no other fossil site in the world was producing in such abundance. Feathers. Not impressions of feathers, not the ghost of feathers in fine-grained sediment. Actual, detailed, structurally complex feathers, preserved in such exquisite detail that in some specimens you could distinguish between the downy basal plumage and the pennaceous feathers of the outer coat. And these feathers were attached not to birds, or not only to birds, but to dinosaurs. Non-avian dinosaurs, theropods, coelurosaurs, animals that by every traditional definition should have been scaly and reptilian. The first major discovery was Sinosauropteryx prima, described in 1996. It was a small compsognathid theropod, roughly the size of a turkey, covered in a coat of simple hair-like filaments along its back and tail. They were not fully formed feathers. They were protofeathers, the evolutionary precursors to the complex structures that would eventually allow flight. But they were unambiguous. They were there. Then came Caudipteryx zoe in 1998, then Microraptor zoianus in 2000, then in 2003, the fossil that stopped the scientific community in its tracks. Microraptor gui. This animal was roughly the size of a crow. It had 4 wings, fully developed pennaceous flight feathers on both its forelimbs and its hind limbs. The hind wing feathers were long and asymmetrical in a way that suggested aerodynamic function, not just display. It was, in the most literal anatomical sense, a 4-winged dinosaur. And it was a Dromaeosaurid, a genuine member of the raptor family, closely related to Velociraptor. When the description was published in Nature in January 2003, the lead author Zhu Xing and his colleagues proposed that Microraptor gui was evidence of an arboreal, tree-dwelling phase in the evolution of flight. The idea was that the ancestor of birds did not evolve flight from the ground up, running and leaping, but from the trees down, gliding at first, then developing powered flight from an already airborne starting position. The paper triggered an immediate and ferocious scientific debate that has not fully resolved to this day. Some researchers argued that the four-wing configuration was genuine evidence of a gliding or flying capability. Others pointed out that the hind limb feathers in the positions shown by the fossil would have severely restricted the animal's ability to walk or run normally, creating a biomechanical problem that the gliding hypothesis did not adequately address. A 2012 study published in Science by a team from the University of Kansas used wind tunnel testing with physical models of Microraptor's wing configuration and concluded that the animal was probably capable of controlled gliding, adopting a posture somewhat like a biplane, forelimbs spread horizontally, hind limbs swept back and down. But a 2013 study challenged even this, arguing that the leg feathers may have been held in a different configuration entirely, one that reduced aerodynamic drag during running rather than contributing to lift. Microraptor GUI remains one of the most debated specimens in all of Mesozoic paleontology, and it matters enormously for our story, because it forces us to confront a question that has no clean answer. If a Dromaeosaurid, a raptor, could have four wings and potentially fly, what does that tell us about the group as a whole? Were Dromaeosaurids descended from flying ancestors who then lost the ability to fly? Or did flight evolve multiple times independently within the theropod lineage? Or were some Dromaeosaurids flying while others were fully terrestrial? The answers to these questions directly affect how we reconstruct Velociraptor, how we think about its forelimbs, how we think about its feathers. Because yes, we now have direct evidence that Velociraptor mongoliensis had feathers. Not from preserved plumage, but from something almost more compelling. In 2007, a team led by Alan Turner, Peter Makovicky, and Mark Norell, researchers at the American Museum of Natural History, published a paper in Science describing a feature on the forearm bones of a Velociraptor specimen from the Utahraptor locality in Mongolia. The feature was a row of small, regularly spaced bumps along the ulna, the inner forearm bone. These bumps are called quill knobs, and quill knobs have one function in modern birds. They are the anchor points for secondary flight feathers. Velociraptor had feathers on its arms. Not small, downy proto-feathers, proper, pennaceous, structurally significant feathers, the kind you find on the wings of a modern hawk or eagle, the kind that, on a flying bird, provide lift and control. On Velociraptor, an animal that could not fly, whose arms were too short and whose body was too heavy for powered flight, these feathers served a different purpose. What purpose? That is where the debate begins. Turner and colleagues suggested several possibilities. Display. Feathers as a visual signal for communication, mate attraction, or territorial warning. Brooding. Using feathered arms to cover eggs or protect young, exactly as modern ground nesting birds do today. Thermoregulation, or, most intriguingly, the possibility that the feathered forelimbs provided some aerodynamic assistance during the raptor prey restraint behavior described by Fowler, helping the animal balance and stabilize while mounted on struggling prey. None of these hypotheses is mutually exclusive. All of them could be partially true simultaneously, and all of them point toward the same fundamental conclusion. The Velociraptor of Jurassic Park, scaly, lizard-skinned, cold and smooth and reptilian, never existed. The real animal had a coat of feathers. It had quill knobs on its arms. It had a skull with relatively large olfactory bulbs, suggesting a sophisticated sense of smell. It had a brain-to-body ratio that, when calculated using the encephalization quotient developed by Harry Jerrison in the 1970s, placed it in the same range as modern flightless birds like emus and cassowaries. Not as high as crows or parrots, but significantly higher than any modern reptile. It had hollow bones. It had a wishbone. It almost certainly sat on its eggs, cradling them beneath feathered arms in exactly the posture that a nesting bird uses today. And it was small. Genuinely, undeniably small. The largest Velociraptor mongoliensis specimens on record reach approximately 2 meters in total length, and much of that length is tail. The standing height at the hip was roughly 50 centimeters. The weight estimate from most current analyses falls between 15 and 20 kilograms. The raptors in Jurassic Park were modeled not on Velociraptor mongoliensis, but on Deinonychus antiropus, scaled up further and given the Velociraptor name at the suggestion of the novel's author, Michael Crichton, who found the name more dramatically satisfying. Steven Spielberg then scaled them up even further for the film. The screenwriters knew this. The scientific consultants, including Robert Bakker, one of the most prominent dinosaur paleontologists of the 20th century, knew this. It was a conscious choice, a dramatic choice. It was, in the precise sense of the word, fiction. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while Hollywood was busy making Velociraptor famous, while children around the world were learning to spell a genus name that most adults had never encountered before 1993, the real Dromaeosaurid family was revealing itself to be something far more extraordinary than the movie version. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the discovery that happened with almost impossibly perfect timing just weeks before Jurassic Park opened in theaters. The discovery of a genuine giant. The date is mid-March 1993. Jurassic Park is 6 weeks away from its theatrical release. The marketing machine is already running at full power. Merchandise is appearing in stores. The trailer featuring that iconic kitchen scene, those two raptors moving with terrifying coordinated intelligence, is playing in cinemas before every major film. The name Velociraptor is entering the cultural vocabulary of an entire generation. And in a laboratory at the College of Eastern Utah in Price, a paleontologist named James Kirkland is looking at a claw. Not a small claw, not the 12-centimeter sickle of Deinonychus. This claw, excavated from a site in the Yellow Cat member of the Cedar Mountain Formation in eastern Utah, measures approximately 22 centimeters along its outer curve. It is the largest Dromaeosaurid claw ever found, and it belongs to an animal whose existence, in that moment, only a handful of people on Earth know about. Kirkland and his colleagues, including Don Burge and John Madsen, are sitting on a discovery that will, within weeks, create one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of paleontology and popular culture simultaneously. They are looking at Utahraptor. The full species name, when formally published in a 1993 paper in the journal Huntaria, would become Utahraptor ostromesorum, named in honor of John Ostrom, the man whose work on Deinonychus had started the scientific revolution that made this discovery meaningful, and Chris Mays of Dynamation International, who helped fund the research. But in those weeks before publication, before Jurassic Park opened, the animal existed in a peculiar liminal space, known to science but not yet named, real but not yet officially real. Robert Bakker, one of the most colorful and outspoken figures in 20th century paleontology, heard about the discovery and reportedly said something that has become one of the most quoted lines in dinosaur science. He said with characteristic lack of restraint that God had created Utahraptor to make the movie look good. It was a joke, but it captured something true about the moment. Here was Hollywood inventing a giant raptor for dramatic effect, scaling Deinonychus up to human height, giving it reptilian skin and terrifying intelligence, and the name of a much smaller animal. And here, simultaneously, in the red rock of eastern Utah, was an actual giant raptor emerging from the ground, as if the Earth itself was trying to meet the filmmakers halfway. Except Utahraptor ostromysorum was not quite what Hollywood had imagined. Let us talk about what it actually was. The Cedar Mountain Formation, where Utahraptor was found, is a geological unit deposited during the early Cretaceous period, approximately 130 to 100 million years ago. This is significantly older than the Jadokta Formation, where Velociraptor lived. Utahraptor ostromysorum predates Velociraptor mongoliensis by roughly 55 to 60 million years. These were not contemporaries. They were separated by an interval of time longer than the entire span from the extinction of the dinosaurs to the present day. This matters. It matters enormously because it means that the Dromaeosaurid family, the raptor lineage, did not start small and grow large over time in a simple linear progression. The evolutionary history of this group was far more complicated, far more branching, far more strange. Utahraptor is currently the largest confirmed dromaeosaurid ever discovered. The estimates from the known specimens, which include partial skull material, vertebrae, limb bones, and multiple claw elements, suggest an animal approximately 5 to 7 meters in total length. The weight estimates are more contentious, ranging in different studies from 280 kilograms at the lower end to 500 kilograms at the upper end, depending on the body mass modeling method used. But even the conservative estimate makes Utahraptor ostromysorum roughly 15 to 20 times heavier than Velociraptor mongoliensis. This was not a turkey-sized, bird-like predator. This was a genuine, large theropod, comparable in mass to a modern polar bear, armed with a sickle claw the size of a large kitchen knife, and equipped with the same general anatomical toolkit that made all dromaeosaurids such effective predators. But here is what makes the Utahraptor story genuinely extraordinary, and what elevates it from a simply impressive fossil find to one of the most scientifically significant dromaeosaurid discoveries of the last 30 years. In 2001, a team led by Virginia Tidwell working near Moab, Utah, began excavating what appeared to be a bone bed in the Cedar Mountain Formation. Bone beds, sites where the remains of multiple individuals are found in close association, are relatively common for some dinosaur species, particularly large herbivores like hadrosaurs or ceratopsians. They are much rarer for large predators. What the Moab excavation revealed over more than a decade of careful, painstaking work was a block of sandstone approximately 9 meters long and 5 meters wide. And inside that block, jumbled and overlapping and compacted by 70 million years of geological pressure, were the bones of at least 6 Utahraptor individuals. Adults, juveniles, at least one animal that researchers estimated was not yet fully grown. A family group, or something very much like one. The excavation, which continued under the direction of James Kirkland into the 2010s, also revealed something that complicated the picture further. Mixed in with the Utahraptor bones were the bones of a large iguanodontid dinosaur, a plant eater that, based on size estimates, would have been a formidable animal in its own right, potentially approaching 10 meters in length. The current interpretation, though contested in some of its details, is that this bone bed preserves a predation event that went catastrophically wrong. The Utahraptor group, possibly a family unit, possibly an opportunistic aggregation of individuals drawn to the same prey, attacked or scavenged the large iguanodontid. And then something happened. The ground gave way. A sand trap, a pocket of liquefied, unstable sediment common in floodplain environments, swallowed the entire scene. Predators and prey together, preserved for 125 million years. When Kirkland and his team published preliminary findings from this excavation, the implications for Dromaeosaurid social behavior were immediate and significant. Because if Utahraptor did aggregate around large prey, even if that aggregation was opportunistic rather than coordinated, it suggested that the social complexity implied by the Hollywood version of raptor pack hunting might not be entirely fictional. It was just attributed to the wrong animal. And this is the thread that leads us directly into one of the most heated ongoing debates in dinosaur paleontology. The question of group hunting in Dromaeosaurids. The question that Jurassic Park answered with such cinematic confidence and that real science has been wrestling with ever since. Because the evidence is genuinely complicated, and it forces us to be honest about the difference between what fossils can tell us and what we wish they could tell us. Let us start with what we know. Multiple Dromaeosaurid species are found in bone bed contexts that suggest group association. Deinonychus antiropus, in particular, has been found in several localities in the Cloverleaf Formation in close spatial association with the remains of Tenontosaurus toletti, a large ornithopod dinosaur that, at roughly 6 to 8 meters in length, was significantly larger than any individual Deinonychus. The most famous of these sites, excavated by Ostrom himself and later reanalyzed by multiple teams, contain the bones of at least 4 Deinonychus individuals associated with a single Tenontosaurus. This was the primary fossil evidence that Ostrom cited when he suggested that Deinonychus might have hunted cooperatively. The logic was straightforward. An individual Deinonychus weighing perhaps 70 to 100 kilograms would face enormous risks attacking a Tenontosaurus that might weigh 1.5 to 2,000 kilograms. But a coordinated group of Deinonychus attacking from multiple directions simultaneously could potentially overwhelm such a prey animal while reducing the risk to any individual. It was a compelling hypothesis, and it became the foundation for the raptor pack behavior depicted in Jurassic Park. But in 2007, a paper by Brian Roach and Daniel Brinkman, published in the Bulletin of the Peabody Museum of Natural History, took a hard look at the same fossil evidence and reached a very different conclusion. Roach and Brinkman pointed out something that had been underweighted in previous analyses. The Deinonychus bones found in association with Tenontosaurus were not just present at the site. They showed evidence of having been fed upon. There were tooth marks on Deinonychus bones, tooth marks consistent with Deinonychus itself. The researchers proposed an alternative scenario, not cooperative pack hunting, but competitive group feeding. Multiple Deinonychus individuals drawn to the same carcass, competing aggressively with each other for access to the meat. Fighting. Killing each other in some cases. A chaotic, dangerous scrum around a shared food source rather than a coordinated tactical assault. The analogy they drew was not to wolves, the social hunters that raptor pack behavior has always evoked. The analogy was to Komodo dragons. Modern Komodo dragons are large predatory reptiles that do aggregate around large prey or carcasses. They do not coordinate. They do not cooperate. They compete, aggressively and sometimes lethally, for individual access to food. They are tolerant of each other's presence only to the degree that the food source is large enough to make fighting more costly than feeding. The Roach and Brinkman paper did not settle the debate. Nothing has settled the debate, but it shifted the burden of proof. It forced researchers to acknowledge that the presence of multiple predators at the same site does not by itself demonstrate cooperative hunting. It could just as easily demonstrate competitive scavenging. And here is where the honest, scientific answer has to be. We do not know. We do not know whether Dromaeosaurids hunted cooperatively. We have no direct fossil evidence of coordinated predatory behavior, no frozen moment analogous to the fighting dinosaur specimen, but showing multiple raptors attacking a single large prey animal in an organized way. What we have are spatial associations and bone bed patterns that are consistent with multiple hypotheses. Some researchers, including the influential dinosaur behaviorist Thomas Holtz, maintain that some degree of social aggregation during hunting is plausible for at least some Dromaeosaurid species. Others, including Roach, argue that the evidence better supports an opportunistic, competitive model. What both sides agree on is this. Whatever the social dynamics of Dromaeosaurid hunting, it was not the slick, coordinated, almost military tactical behavior shown in Jurassic Park. The raptors in that film communicate like soldiers on a battlefield, distract prey while another attacks from the flank, adjust their strategy in real time based on their prey's responses. That level of behavioral complexity, that degree of theory of mind and real-time tactical coordination, goes well beyond what even the most generous interpretation of the fossil evidence supports. Which is not to say that Dromaeosaurids were stupid. They were not. And to understand why, we need to talk about the endocast. An endocast is a cast of the interior of the brain case, the bony cavity that housed the brain. In many well-preserved dinosaur skulls, the natural infilling of sediment inside the brain case creates a natural endocast that can be studied directly. In other cases, researchers use CT scanning to digitally reconstruct the brain cavity from the inside, producing a three-dimensional model of what the brain itself might have looked like. Multiple Dromaeosaurid endocasts have been studied. The results are consistent across species. Dromaeosaurids had relatively large brains for their body size, significantly larger proportionally than most other non-avian dinosaurs. The olfactory bulbs were large, suggesting a well-developed sense of smell. The optic lobes were large, suggesting acute vision. The cerebellum, the region associated with motor coordination and balance, was proportionally enlarged in a way that is more consistent with modern birds than with modern reptiles. A 2005 study by Whitmer and Ridgely used CT scanning to analyze the inner ear geometry of several theropod dinosaurs, including Dromaeosaurids. The geometry of the semicircular canals, the structures responsible for balance and spatial orientation, in Dromaeosaurids was strikingly similar to that of modern birds of prey. It suggested an animal capable of rapid head movements, quick postural adjustments, and a level of spatial awareness that would be consistent with agile, active predatory behavior. But here is what the endocast cannot tell us. It cannot tell us whether Velociraptor could solve problems, whether it could learn from experience, whether it communicated with members of its own species beyond basic instinctive signaling, whether it had anything resembling what we would call intent or planning. The Jurassic Park raptors open doors. They remember which human tricked them. They set traps. They learn. The film presents them as having something dangerously close to human-level cunning. The real animal had a brain probably comparable in cognitive complexity to a modern emu or cassowary, which is not nothing. Cassowaries are genuinely dangerous animals with real problem-solving capabilities. But it is also not the terrifying tactical intelligence of the Hollywood version. The truth is more interesting than the myth, and more humbling. Velociraptor was not a scaly, cold-blooded killing machine. It was not a feathered genius. It was something in between, a highly specialized, sensorially sophisticated, feathered predator operating at the edge of the cognitive capabilities available to non-avian theropods. An animal shaped by 70 million years of competitive pressure into something genuinely remarkable. But the story of what shaped it, the full ecological context, the competitive landscape, the specific pressures that made Dromaeosaurids what they were, that story requires us to look at one more animal. An animal that Dromaeosaurids competed with, lived alongside, were occasionally killed by. An animal that in the late Cretaceous of Asia represented the absolute pinnacle of theropod evolution. An animal that is, in many ways, the dark mirror of everything Velociraptor was. Its name is Tarbosaurus bataar, and it weighed approximately 5,000 kilograms. 5,000 kilograms. Let that number settle for a moment. 5,000 kilograms. The weight of a fully loaded dump truck. The weight of 3 adult hippopotamuses. The weight of every Velociraptor mongoliensis specimen ever found, combined, multiplied several times over. This was the animal that shared the late Cretaceous landscape of Asia with Velociraptor. Not a distant neighbor, not a creature occupying a different ecological zone in a different part of the continent. A predator moving through the same river systems, the same floodplains, the same semi-arid scrublands of what is now Mongolia and China, at roughly the same geological moment. Tarbosaurus bataar. The name translates with appropriate drama as alarming lizard, and alarming is perhaps the politest word available, because Tarbosaurus bataar was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most formidable land predators that has ever existed on this planet. A tyrannosaurid, a close relative of Tyrannosaurus rex, separated from its North American cousin by the western interior seaway and roughly 10 to 15 million years of independent evolution. It reached lengths of approximately 10 to 12 meters. Its skull alone measured up to 1.5 meters in length. Its teeth, the largest of them, were approximately 17 centimeters long and roughly the diameter of a banana. And its bite force, estimated through finite element analysis in studies published in the journal Acta Paleontologica Polonica, was somewhere in the range of 35,000 to 50,000 newtons. To put that in terms you can feel, the bite force of an adult lion is approximately 4,500 newtons. The bite force of a saltwater crocodile, the most powerful living predator bite on record, is approximately 16,000 newtons. Tarbosaurus bataar bit with a force more than 3 times that of the largest crocodile alive today. This was the apex predator of the Namek Formation, the geological layer deposited in what is now southern Mongolia approximately 70 to 68 million years ago, right at the very end of the Cretaceous period. And the Namek Formation is one of the richest dinosaur fossil sites in the world. It has yielded not just Tarbosaurus, but an entire ecosystem. Hadrosaurs like Saurolophus angustirostris, sauropods like Nemectosaurus mongoliensis, ankylosaurs, ornithomimids, and the extraordinary oviraptorid Conchoraptor gracilis, and dromaeosaurids. Multiple dromaeosaurid species are known from the Namek Formation and its associated geological units, including Velociraptor mongoliensis from the slightly earlier Jadokta Formation and Linharaptor exquisitus and Sagan mangas from deposits of similar age. These were the small to medium predators occupying the ecological space beneath Tarbosaurus, the mesopredators, filling the niches that the Tyrannosaurid was too large and too energetically expensive to exploit efficiently. This is a critical ecological concept that the Hollywood version of dinosaur predation almost never addresses. In any healthy predator ecosystem, large apex predators do not actually perform most of the predation. They cannot afford to. A Tarbosaurus that consumed the calories necessary to sustain its 5,000 kilogram body mass could not spend its time chasing down small prey. The energy cost of the pursuit would exceed the caloric return of the catch. Large apex predators specialize in large prey, ambush hunting, bone crushing, consuming enormous quantities of food from a single kill, and then resting for days while digesting. The small and medium prey, the juvenile dinosaurs, the small ornithopods, the lizards, the mammals, the eggs, the insects, those were the province of the mesopredators. And in the late Cretaceous of Asia, the mesopredators were the Dromaeosaurids. Velociraptor in this context was not a miniature apex predator. It was an ecological specialist operating in the space between the very large and the very small. A nimble, feathered, sharp-sensed hunter filling a niche that Tarbosaurus could not fill, and doing so with a degree of anatomical sophistication that makes the Hollywood version look almost quaint by comparison. But here is the question that this ecological picture raises immediately, and that is almost never asked in popular treatments of Velociraptor. What happened when these two animals met? Not in the abstract sense, not as a theoretical exercise in comparative predator ecology. What actually happened in specific documented cases when a Velociraptor or a closely related Dromaeosaurid came into contact with a juvenile or subadult Tyrannosaurid. Because we have evidence. Not abundant evidence, not unambiguous evidence, but evidence. In 2010, a study published in PLOS1 by Denver Fowler and colleagues examined a series of Tyrannosaurid bones from the Hell Creek Formation in North America, the formation that preserves the latest Cretaceous ecosystems of what is now Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Among the specimens examined were juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex bones showing tooth marks inconsistent with adult Tyrannosaurid feeding. The marks were smaller, more numerous, distributed across the bone in patterns suggesting a smaller-jawed predator with different feeding biomechanics. The researchers proposed that Dromaeosaurids, specifically the Hell Creek Dromaeosaurid Utahraptor temertiorum, a close relative of Velociraptor, had been feeding on juvenile Tyrannosaurids. Whether as predators killing young animals or as scavengers accessing carcasses of animals that had died of other causes, the bone mark evidence could not definitively distinguish. But the feeding had occurred. A Dromaeosaurid had eaten a Tyrannosaurid. It is a detail that inverts every assumption the popular imagination makes about these animals. The small feathered predator consuming the great bone crusher, the mesopredator exploiting the vulnerability of the apex predator's offspring in a window of time before those offspring grew large enough to be invulnerable. And it points towards something that paleontologists have increasingly emphasized in recent years. The late Cretaceous was not a simple linear hierarchy with the biggest animal always winning. It was a complex, dynamic, multi-level competitive system in which size was one variable among many. Speed, agility, sensory acuity, reproductive strategy, thermoregulation, habitat preference, social behavior. All of these variables interacted in ways that created space for animals at every size class to succeed, to fail, to exploit opportunities that their competitors could not. And it is within this complexity that we need to place the most extraordinary Dromaeosaurid discovery of the last decade. A discovery that came not from the Gobi Desert, not from Montana, not from Patagonia, but from a place that most people would not immediately associate with dinosaur paleontology: Romania. In 2010, a team of Romanian and British paleontologists, led by Matthias Vremir, began excavating a site in the Transylvanian Basin, a geological depression in central Romania that was, during the latest Cretaceous, a series of islands in a shallow sea at the edge of the Tethys Ocean. The site was in the Sebeș Formation, deposited approximately 69 to 66 million years ago, practically at the boundary of the Cretaceous and Paleogene, almost at the very moment of the mass extinction. What Vremir and his colleagues found was a partial skeleton of a Dromaeosaurid unlike anything previously described from Europe. It was large, significantly larger than Velociraptor. Larger, in fact, than any Dromaeosaurid previously known from Europe, where the island ecosystem had generally produced dwarf forms of dinosaurs. A well-documented phenomenon in island biogeography, where isolated populations trend towards smaller body sizes due to resource limitations. This animal was going the other direction. It was named Velociraptor in a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010. Balaur is a Romanian word for a type of dragon from local folklore. Bondoc means stocky or thick-set. And stocky it was. A dromaeosaurid with an unusually robust build, shortened and heavily muscled limbs, and a feature that genuinely shocked the research team when they first described it. It had 2 sickle claws, not one enlarged sickle claw on the second toe, as in all other known dromaeosaurids. 2. Both the first and second toes bore enlarged, curved, sickle-shaped claws. It was as if the standard dromaeosaurid weaponry had been duplicated, as if evolution had decided that one lethal claw was insufficient and had produced a second one on the same foot. The initial interpretation of Velociraptor cast it as a hyperpredator, a dromaeosaurid that had evolved even more extreme predatory specializations than its relatives in response to the specific prey community of the Transylvanian Islands. But in 2013, Andrea Cow and colleagues published a reanalysis of the Velociraptor material that proposed a radically different interpretation. Their phylogenetic analysis suggested that Balaur was not a highly derived dromaeosaurid. Instead, it might be more closely related to early birds, to the avian lineage itself, than to Velociraptor or Deinonychus. And if that was true, the double sickle claw was not a predatory escalation. It might be a feature retained from an ancestral condition, a remnant of a body plan that predated the full dromaeosaurid specializations. The debate about Velociraptor's phylogenetic position has continued in the literature, with different analyses producing different results depending on the characters weighted and the methods used. It is, as of current research, genuinely unresolved, but it illustrates perfectly the state of dromaeosaurid paleontology as a whole. Every time researchers think they understand the group, every time a coherent picture seems to be emerging of what these animals were, how they evolved, how they lived, a new fossil appears that breaks the model. That introduces a variable nobody had accounted for. That forces the entire framework to expand to accommodate something that should not exist. The four-winged Microraptor, the giant Utahraptor, the double-clawed Balaur, the feather-quilled forearms of Velociraptor, the pack or not pack debate that has never been resolved, the raptor prey restraint model that reimagined the sickle claw entirely. Each of these discoveries arrived not as a confirmation of existing theory, but as a disruption of it. And there is one more disruption, one more discovery that has not received the popular attention it deserves, perhaps because its implications are so strange, so difficult to communicate without a deep understanding of evolutionary biology, that it tends to get buried in technical literature rather than reaching a wider audience. It concerns the question of where dromaeosaurids came from. Not in the geological sense. We know the formations, we know the time periods, we have a reasonable phylogenetic framework for how the group diversified. But in the deeper evolutionary sense, What was the ancestor of the Dromaeosaurids? What body plan did they evolve from? And what does that ancestry tell us about the direction of evolution in the Paravian theropods, the broader group that includes Dromaeosaurids, troodontids, and birds? For most of the 20th century, the assumption was straightforward. Paravians evolved from ground-dwelling theropod ancestors. They were terrestrial animals that developed increasingly bird-like features over time: lighter bones, more mobile forelimbs, eventually feathers, in a progressive sequence leading from fully terrestrial predators to the first flying birds. It was a clean narrative, ground to air, simple, linear, satisfying. The problem is that the fossil evidence, when examined carefully and without the pressure of fitting it into a pre-existing story, does not fully support it. The small Paravians from the Jurassic and early Cretaceous of China, animals like Anchiornis huxleyi, Xiaotingia zhengai, and Epidexipteryx hui, show a mosaic of features that does not fit cleanly into a simple ground-to-air progression. Some of these animals appear to have had arboreal adaptations, curved claws suited for gripping branches, proportions more consistent with climbing than running. Some had feathers on their feet as well as their arms. Some had body proportions that biomechanical modeling suggests were more consistent with gliding or parachuting than with either running or powered flight. In 2011, a paper by Zhu Xing and colleagues published in Nature proposed, on the basis of a new phylogenetic analysis, that Anchiornis and Xiaotingia, animals previously classified as early birds, were actually troodontids or Deinonychosaurs. This had a dramatic implication. It suggested that the earliest members of the group that would eventually include both birds and dromaeosaurids were small, possibly arboreal or semi-arboreal animals, not ground-running predators. If this is correct, and the debate is ongoing with different analyses reaching different conclusions, it raises a genuinely vertiginous possibility. The dromaeosaurids, including Velociraptor, may not have evolved toward birds. They may have evolved away from them. The ancestral Paravian may have been a small, feathered, possibly tree-dwelling animal with some capacity for aerial locomotion, and the dromaeosaurids, with their enlarged, sickle claws and their robust hind limbs and their terrestrial predatory lifestyle, may represent a secondary return to the ground, a lineage that descended from something capable of flight or gliding and then abandoned that capability in favor of a different predatory strategy. Birds went one way, dromaeosaurids went another. Which means that when you look at a Velociraptor mongoliensis, when you try to reconstruct it in your mind as accurately as the fossil evidence allows, you are not looking at a reptile that was on its way to becoming a bird. You are looking at something stranger and more poignant than that. You are looking at a bird that became a predator, a lineage that had, somewhere in its deep evolutionary history, touched the sky and then came back down, traded the air for the ground, traded lift for grip, traded the freedom of flight for the specific, bloody, intimate business of hunting at close range. Feathered arms that once, perhaps in some ancestor, caught the wind, now used to grip and hold struggling prey. Hollow bones that once provided buoyancy in flight, now carrying a predator across desert sand at speeds that CT-based biomechanical modeling, published by a team from the Royal Veterinary College in 2017, estimates at somewhere between 25 and 40 kilometers per hour. Not as fast as the Hollywood version suggested. The Jurassic Park raptors were depicted as capable of speeds approaching 60 kilometers per hour, fast enough to catch a running human with ease. The real biomechanical analysis, accounting for actual limb proportions and estimated muscle mass, suggests something considerably slower. Fast for its size, certainly. Agile, certainly, but not the sprinting nightmare of the films. More like a large, feathered, very determined, and very well-armed bird, chasing you across the sand. And that image, stripped of Hollywood excess, stripped of the reptilian skin and the inflated size and the pack tactics lifted from wolf documentaries, that image is, in its own way, more disturbing than the movie version, because it is real. It happened. 74 million years ago, on a floodplain that is now desert, a feathered predator the size of a large dog was chasing something through the scrub. Using senses we are only beginning to understand. Employing hunting strategies we are still debating. Operating within an ecosystem of almost incomprehensible complexity and richness. And then, 66 million years ago, almost everything changed. The question of what happened to Velociraptor, to the Dromaeosaurids as a whole, to the entire extraordinary experiment of non-avian dinosaur evolution, brings us to the event that defines the end of everything we have been discussing. The event that, in a very literal sense, decided which direction evolution would go next. The impact. But before we get to the asteroid, before we talk about the end, we need to spend a moment with the question that most popular treatments rush past in their eagerness to get to the extinction. The question of whether the Dromaeosaurids were already in decline before the impact arrived. Whether the world they had dominated was already changing around them. Whether the asteroid, when it came, was delivering a killing blow to a group already weakened, or wiping out animals that were still, in the final hours of the Cretaceous, thriving. Because the answer changes the story entirely. The last day of the Cretaceous was a Tuesday. Not literally. We do not have that level of precision, but we have something almost as remarkable. A geological record so detailed, so globally consistent, so chemically specific, that we can reconstruct not just the year, but the season. Not just the season, but the time of day. Not just the time of day, but the sequence of events in the first hours after impact, with a resolution that continues to improve with every new study. What we cannot reconstruct quite so cleanly is what the world looked like in the years and decades and centuries leading up to that moment. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we know about the impact and what we know about the ecosystems it destroyed, sits at the center of one of the most important and least resolved debates in all of paleontological science. Were the dinosaurs already dying? The question sounds almost provocative. It has been asked and argued and partially answered and reopened so many times over the last 40 years that some researchers have grown visibly tired of it. But it matters. It matters enormously, because the answer determines whether the Chicxulub impactor, the asteroid or comet body estimated at approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, that struck the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico approximately 66 million years ago, was the sole cause of the non-avian dinosaur extinction, or whether it was the final blow in a longer decline. And for the Dromaeosaurids specifically, the picture is troubling. Here is the problem. The fossil record of Dromaeosaurids in the latest Cretaceous, the final 2 to 3 million years before the impact, is remarkably sparse. Not just sparse, almost empty. From the Hell Creek Formation of North America, which preserves the last approximately 1.5 million years of the Cretaceous period in extraordinary detail, we have exactly 2 confirmed Dromaeosaurid species, a Microraptor temertiorum, described in 2013 from fragmentary dental and jaw material, and a second unnamed form known only from isolated teeth. That is it. two species, both known from scrappy material, in a formation that has yielded hundreds of other dinosaur specimens representing dozens of species. From the Namek Formation of Mongolia, the picture is similarly thin. The large Dromaeosaurids that characterized earlier formations, the diverse community of small to medium predators that made the Jadokta and Barun Goyot formations so rich, are largely absent from the latest Cretaceous deposits of Central Asia. This has led some researchers to propose what is sometimes called the late Cretaceous Dromaeosaurid decline hypothesis, the idea that the family was already contracting in diversity and abundance in the final stages of the Mesozoic, well before the asteroid arrived. But here is where intellectual honesty requires a pause. The sparse late Cretaceous Dromaeosaurid record might not reflect an actual decline. It might reflect a preservational bias. Small animals with lightweight, hollow bones are significantly less likely to fossilize and be preserved than large animals with dense, robust skeletons. The Hell Creek Formation is famous for its Tyrannosaurus rex specimens precisely because a 5,000-kilogram animal with thick cortical bone has an enormous fossilization advantage over a 20-kilogram feathered predator with bird-like bone density. A 2016 paper by Broussat, Butler, Barrett, and colleagues, published in Biological Reviews, attempted to address this bias directly by using statistical methods to correct for sampling effort and preservational probability. Their analysis suggested that non-avian dinosaurs as a whole were not in significant decline in the 10 million years before the impact, that diversity was relatively stable, though with some regional variation. But a 2012 study by Sakamoto, Benton, and Venditti, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, reached a different conclusion. Using a different analytical framework, one focused on speciation and extinction rates rather than raw diversity counts, this study suggested that many dinosaur lineages were indeed experiencing declining evolutionary rates in the late Cretaceous. They were not generating new species as rapidly as they had in earlier periods. The evolutionary engine was slowing. Not stopped, not broken, but running at reduced capacity. And into this picture of possible but contested decline, the Deccan traps introduce another variable that makes the story even more complicated. The Deccan traps are a massive volcanic province in what is now west-central India, one of the largest accumulations of volcanic rock on Earth, covering an area of approximately 500,000 square kilometers and reaching depths of more than 2 kilometers in some places. They were produced by a mantle plume, a column of superheated rock rising from deep within the Earth that began erupting approximately 66 million years ago. And the timing of that eruption, relative to the Chicxulub impact, has been the subject of intense research and considerable controversy. What the most recent geochronological studies have established, including a high-precision analysis published in Science in 2019 by a team from Princeton University led by Blair Shoney, is that the Deccan Traps eruptions occurred in two main pulses. The first pulse predates the Chicxulub impact by approximately 250,000 years. The second pulse, significantly larger, occurred after the impact, possibly triggered or accelerated by the seismic energy of the impact itself, which would have been powerful enough to affect volcanic systems on the opposite side of the planet. The environmental effects of the pre-impact Deccan volcanism were real and measurable. Sulfur dioxide emissions caused short-term cooling events. Carbon dioxide emissions caused longer-term warming. Ocean acidification increased. Ecosystems experienced stress. Not catastrophic civilization-ending stress, but chronic, persistent, system-level stress of the kind that erodes biodiversity at the margins, pushing species that are already struggling past the point of recovery. Were the Dromaeosaurids among those marginal species in the final centuries before the impact? Genuinely, honestly, we do not know. The fossil record is too incomplete. The statistical tools available are too blunt. The honest answer is that we can see the outlines of a possible decline, and we can identify the mechanisms that might have driven it, but we cannot confirm it. What we can confirm is what happened next. 66 million years ago, late spring in the northern hemisphere. We know this from analysis of plant fossils in the boundary layer, which show spring growth patterns interrupted at the exact moment of impact. Possibly mid-morning local time, based on patterns in the debris distribution and the angle of the impactor trajectory, which multiple research teams have estimated at approximately 60 degrees from horizontal, striking from the northeast. The object, whether asteroid or comet, remains technically debated, though the geochemical evidence strongly favors an asteroid of carbonaceous chondrite composition, enters the atmosphere at a speed estimated between 20 and 70 kilometers per second. At those velocities, the atmosphere provides essentially no resistance. The object strikes the shallow carbonate platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, before the pressure wave ahead of it has time to do more than strip the surface of vegetation in a widening circle. The impact releases energy equivalent to approximately 100 million megatons of TNT. That number requires context. The most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated, the Soviet Tsar Bomba, tested in 1961, released energy equivalent to 50 megatons. The Chicxulub impact released the energy of 2 million Tsar Bombas simultaneously, in a fraction of a second. The immediate effects within a radius of approximately 1,000 kilometers are essentially instantaneous and total. Vaporization, ejecta traveling at escape velocity, a fireball expanding faster than the speed of sound. Everything within that zone is gone before anything has time to respond. But the global effects, the effects that killed animals in Mongolia, in Argentina, in Antarctica, in every ecosystem on every continent, those effects took longer. And understanding them requires understanding the specific chemistry of what Chicxulub hit. The Yucatan platform was not random geography. It was composed primarily of carbonate and sulfate rocks, limestone and gypsum, deposited over tens of millions of years in a shallow tropical sea. When the impactor vaporized these rocks, it did not just produce the generic debris cloud of a rocky impact. It produced specific chemical compounds in specific quantities. Sulfur dioxide, in amounts estimated at 100 billion tons or more. Sulfur dioxide in the upper atmosphere reacts with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols, tiny, highly reflective particles that can persist at high altitude for years. And sulfuric acid aerosols block sunlight efficiently, globally, persistently. A 2017 climate modeling study published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters, led by Julia Brugger at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, estimated that global surface temperatures may have dropped by as much as 26 degrees Celsius within the first year after impact. That is not a cold snap. That is the elimination of almost all meaningful photosynthesis across the entire planet. Not for weeks, not for months, for years. The food web from the bottom up collapsed. Plants died. Phytoplankton died. Every animal that depended on living plants, which is ultimately every animal, faced starvation. The larger the animal, the greater its caloric requirements, and the faster it starved. A 5,000-kilogram Tarbosaurus, requiring hundreds of kilograms of food per week to maintain its metabolism, lasted weeks at most. A 150-kilogram Hadrosaur, perhaps a few months. Even the smaller dinosaurs, the Dromaeosaurids, the Troodontids, the Oviraptorids, faced caloric deficits that their metabolisms could not sustain. In the Hell Creek Formation, the pattern is preserved with brutal clarity. Below the boundary layer, the thin, globally distributed layer of iridium-rich clay that marks the exact moment of impact, the fossil record is rich. Tyrannosaurs, hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, dromaeosaurids. Above it, in the earliest Paleogene deposits, there are no non-avian dinosaurs. None. Not a tooth, not a fragment of bone, not a footprint. The line is not gradual. It is not a slope. It is a wall. On one side of that wall, 66 million years of dinosaur dominance. On the other side, something entirely different. But here is the detail that changes everything about how you think about this story. The line is not absolute, because some dinosaurs survived. Not many. Not the large ones, not the apex predators or the giant herbivores or the armored tanks or the horned giants, but a small subset of one particular lineage, small-bodied, feathered, capable of exploiting whatever food resources remained in the post-impact darkness, crossed that wall. They were the avian dinosaurs, the birds. And the question of why they survived when their relatives did not has occupied researchers for decades and is still not fully resolved. Several hypotheses have been proposed, and most of them are probably partially correct simultaneously. Body size. The surviving bird lineages were small enough that their caloric requirements were manageable even in a severely resource-depleted environment. A 20-gram ancestral bird needs a fraction of the food that a 20-kilogram Dromaeosaurid requires. Diet. The earliest Paleogene bird survivors appear to have been seed eaters or omnivores, animals capable of exploiting seeds, tubers, insects, and other food sources that persisted through the impact winter. Seeds, in particular, are extraordinarily durable. They can remain viable in soil for years. A bird that could crack seeds had a food source available when almost nothing else did. Beak versus teeth. Modern birds lack teeth entirely. The transition from toothed to toothless jaws in the avian lineage was already well underway by the latest Cretaceous. A beak is lighter, faster, more versatile for processing small food items than a toothed jaw. In a world where food is scarce and small, this matters, and possibly, though this is more speculative, behavior. The brooding behavior shared by all modern birds, the ability to regulate egg temperature actively, the degree of parental investment in offspring survival. These behaviors may have provided a reproductive resilience that purely nest-abandoning strategies could not match. The Dromaeosaurids had some of these advantages. They were feathered. They had large brains. The evidence from oviraptorid specimens, closely related to Dromaeosaurids, strongly suggests active brooding behavior, and it is reasonable to infer something similar for Dromaeosaurids. They were not large, but they had teeth, and they appear to have been, in the latest Cretaceous, primarily predators of animal prey, a food source that collapsed almost as completely as plant material in the post-impact environment. Without large prey animals to hunt, without the ecosystem that had supported them for tens of millions of years, the Dromaeosaurid predatory specialization became a liability rather than an asset. The birds that survived were the generalists, the opportunists. The small, flexible, seed-cracking, insect-grabbing, anything edible-consuming survivors who did not need a functional Cretaceous ecosystem to persist. The Dromaeosaurids were specialists, and in the post-impact world, specialization was a death sentence. So they died. Not instantly, not all on the same day. The extinction of any lineage is a process, not an event. a cascading sequence of local population collapses, failed breeding seasons, contracting ranges, and final isolated populations dwindling toward zero. But within a geological eye blink, within perhaps 10,000 to 100,000 years of the impact, the Dromaeosaurids were gone. Velociraptor mongoliensis, Deinonychus anteropus, Utahraptor ostromysorum, Balor bondoc, Microraptor gui, Utahraptor temertiorum. Every species, every lineage, every branch of the most sophisticated predator family the Mesozoic world had produced. Gone. Except they were not entirely gone, because the thing that makes this story genuinely extraordinary, the detail that transforms it from a tale of extinction into something more complicated and more beautiful, is what the Dromaeosaurids left behind. They left the birds. Not metaphorically, not as a symbolic legacy. Literally. The birds alive today, all 10,000 plus species of them, from the albatross soaring over the Southern Ocean, to the hummingbird hovering outside a window in Mexico City, to the crow solving a puzzle on a rooftop in Tokyo, are the living descendants of the theropod dinosaur lineage. They are dinosaurs. The clade Dinosauria did not go extinct 66 million years ago. It contracted. It was pruned catastrophically, but it survived in the form of the birds. And then it exploded outward again into an extraordinary diversity that continues to this day. And within that living dinosaur diversity, the closest relatives of Velociraptor mongoliensis are not some obscure distant branch. The Dromaeosaurid lineage sits phylogenetically as close to modern birds as it is possible to get without being a bird. The evolutionary distance between Velociraptor and a modern hawk is genuinely smaller than the distance between a modern alligator and a modern gecko. When you watch a hawk fold its wings in a dive, you are watching a movement pattern that shares deep homology with the wing folding of a dromaeosaurid. When you watch a crow manipulate an object with focused, intelligent attention, you are watching a cognitive style that has roots in the theropod brain architecture that Velociraptor shared. When you watch a cassowary, those extraordinary, dangerous, deeply strange birds of New Guinea and northern Australia, move through dense forest with a combination of power and precision that seems almost prehistoric, you are seeing something that is not a metaphor for a Cretaceous predator. It is one. The cassowary's inner toe claw, the one it uses defensively, capable of inflicting serious injury on large animals, is not analogous to the Velociraptor sickle claw. It is the same structure, modified by 66 million years of independent evolution, yes. Serving a different purpose in a different body in a different world, yes. But derived from the same ancestral anatomy, expressing the same basic developmental program, built from the same evolutionary raw material. Velociraptor is not gone. It is changed almost beyond recognition. It is scattered into 10,000 forms across every continent on Earth. It is singing outside your window in the morning. It is stealing food from outdoor tables. It is navigating by magnetic fields across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. It is solving problems in laboratory experiments that would have impressed John Ostrom and astonished Roy Chapman Andrews. It survived. Just not the way anyone expected. And that, perhaps more than any specific bone measurement or force calculation or phylogenetic analysis, is the real lesson of Velociraptor mongoliensis. The lesson is about the relationship between specialization and survival, about the difference between being perfectly adapted to one world and being flexible enough to survive the destruction of that world, about the ways in which the very qualities that make a lineage successful in stable conditions can become the qualities that doom it when conditions change catastrophically. The Dromaeosaurids were extraordinary. They were among the most sophisticated predators in the history of life on this planet. Their anatomy was refined, their senses were acute, their brains were large, their ecological roles were well-defined and effectively executed. They have been doing what they did for tens of millions of years. And then the world changed faster than they could. The birds, their relatives, their near twins in evolutionary terms, were doing something slightly different, something less specialized, something that looked, from the outside, like a less impressive version of the Dromaeosaurid strategy. Smaller, less armed, less obviously formidable, but flexible enough. And flexibility, it turns out, is the only quality that the universe ultimately rewards without reservation. 75 million years ago, a feathered predator the size of a large dog was moving through the scrubland of what is now Mongolia, tracking prey by scent, feeling the air temperature shift as the sun moved across a sky that looked almost exactly like our own. It had no idea that it was part of one of the most important evolutionary stories ever told. It had no interest in the debate about pack hunting, or the biomechanics of its sickle claw, or the question of whether it was more closely related to a bird or a lizard. It was hungry. It was alive. It was exactly what 60 million years of theropod evolution had produced, running on a planet that still had 66 million years of non-avian dinosaur dominance ahead of it. Or so it seemed. The Hollywood version of this animal got almost everything wrong. The size, the skin, the speed, the intelligence, the hunting behavior, the ecological role. The very name applied to an animal that the film's creators knew was not the actual Velociraptor. But here is the strange thing. The strange, almost poetic irony at the heart of this entire story. In getting everything wrong about Velociraptor, Hollywood accidentally got one thing right. It made you care. It put the name in your mouth. It made you learn to spell it. It made tens of millions of people around the world feel a genuine, visceral, almost personal connection to an animal that had been dead for 66 million years. It created the cultural appetite, the hunger for information, the desire to understand, that drove a generation of children toward paleontology, toward evolutionary biology, toward the deep time of Earth history that most people never encounter and that changes everyone who does encounter it. The scientists who have spent their careers correcting the Hollywood version, Norell, Turner, Makovicki, Fowler, Shuxing, Kirkland, and dozens of others, they would not be household names in the paleontological community without the cultural moment that Jurassic Park created. The funding that has supported Dromaeosaurid research, the public interest that has kept museum collections accessible, the popular science books and documentaries and podcasts and YouTube channels that have carried the real story to real audiences, all of it exists downstream of a fictional raptor that was too big and too scaly and too smart and not at all what the science actually shows. Hollywood lied to you about Velociraptor, but the lie created the conversation that eventually told you the truth. And the truth, the real animal, feathered and fierce and improbably bird-like, moving through a desert landscape 75 million years old, part of an evolutionary story that did not end with the asteroid, but continues in every bird alive today. The truth is so much stranger and richer and more wonderful than anything a screenwriter invented. The bones are in the ground. The feather quill knobs are on the ulna. The fighting dinosaurs are locked together in the Mongolian Museum of Natural History, preserved in the exact instant of a struggle that nobody witnessed except the sand that buried them. And somewhere outside your window, right now, a bird is doing something that Velociraptor would recognize. The lineage continues. The question of what else it might eventually become, what forms are still ahead, what evolutionary experiments are still waiting to unfold across the next 66 million years of deep time. That question belongs to the future. But the past is already extraordinary enough. Experiments are still waiting to unfold across the next 66 million years of deep time. That question belongs to the future. But the past is already extraordinary enough.